August 25, 1944, the roads of northern France trembled under the endless roar of engines. Convoys of olive-drab trucks stretched beyond the horizon, their headlights covered in red filters that turned the night into a river of dim, glowing embers. The men driving them called it the Red Ball Express. Just weeks earlier, American forces had broken out of the Normandy hedgerows, moving faster than anyone thought possible. General George S. Patton's Third Army advanced across France like a steel storm, but there was a problem. His tanks were hungry. They devoured fuel faster than the supply lines could reach them. German generals, watching from their bunkers, laughed at the absurd pace. "They'll run out of gas," one staff officer wrote. The Americans are slaves to their own machinery. They believed logistics would cripple Patton long before German firepower could, but what they didn't understand was that American industry and organization had forged a new kind of weapon, one measured not in guns or armor, but in movement. Within days, over 6,000 trucks were pulled from every corner of the Allied forces, manned by soldiers, many of them African American, who would drive day and night, hauling fuel, ammunition, and rations from Normandy beaches to the front. Each truck carried the lifeblood of Patton's advance, 125-octane gasoline, stacked in jerrycans and drums. Sloshing in the dark, they followed a single rule: keep 'em rolling. No stopping, no turning back. The route stretched over 700 kilometers, a pulsing artery of supply that fed one of the fastest military offensives in history, and as the convoys rolled through ruined villages and shattered roads, the laughter from Berlin began to fade. By late August 1944, the Red Ball Express was more than a convoy, it was a living artery. Hundreds of trucks roared across France day and night, carrying fuel, ammunition, and hope to the front. The roads were narrow, cratered, and jammed with wrecked vehicles. Yet the wheels never stopped turning. Most of the drivers were barely 20 years old. They came from farms, factories, and city streets. Ordinary Americans thrust into an extraordinary mission. Nearly 75% were African American soldiers, serving in segregated units, often denied glory but bearing the weight of victory. They drove without rest, fueled by coffee and courage, guided only by the red glow of blackout lamps cutting through fog and rain. Danger was everywhere. German planes hunted the convoys, snipers fired from the woods, accidents were common. One mistake, and a truck filled with gasoline could become a fireball. Still, the motto held firm: keep 'em rolling. Each vehicle hauled up to 5,000 pounds of fuel, enough to keep Patton's armored columns moving one more hour, one more mile. The tanks burned through 350,000 gallons daily, and every drop came from these drivers, men who risked their lives not with rifles, but with steering wheels. Patton's advance cut deep into German lines, but the trucks followed faster than the enemy could retreat. Villagers lined the roads, cheering the endless stream of engines and dust. To them, it looked like an army without end, a steel river flowing east toward victory. At night, from the hills, the red-filtered headlights of thousands of trucks turned the dark horizon into a glowing ribbon, and for the first time, German generals realized what they were truly facing: not just an army of men, but the unstoppable machinery of an entire nation on wheels. September 10, 1944, in a damp bunker near the Siegfried Line, German generals gathered around a flickering map. Red arrows stretched across France, deeper every day. The Americans, they said, were reckless, moving too fast, too far. They'll choke on their own gasoline. One officer scoffed, another laughed. Let them. The roads will eat them alive. But reports kept coming, convoys hundreds of miles long, trucks pouring through every hour. Patton's tanks weren't slowing down, they were accelerating. General Gunther Blumentritt, a veteran of the Western Front, stared at the figures in disbelief. Fuel consumption, tonnage, routes, it didn't make sense. How? He whispered. How can they move so much, so fast? The answer was simple and terrifying. America's factories had built a war engine that Germany could never match. Where the Wehrmacht had trains, the US had wheels, millions of them. Where German fuel came in barrels guarded like treasure, the Americans sent rivers of it flowing down highways that never slept. By September, the Red Ball Express was running over 6,000 trucks daily, burning its own fuel just to feed the front. Each vehicle carried a piece of America's industrial heart. Rubber from Ohio, engines from Detroit, steel from Pennsylvania. The convoy was more than logistics. It was a moving symbol of everything the Third Reich lacked: abundance, mobility, and unity of purpose. German soldiers began calling it Die Rollen Fabrik, the rolling factory. Even captured officers admitted it was genius. Colonel von Waldau wrote in his diary, "They fight with engines, not with men." The laughter stopped. Every report that reached Berlin now carried the same warning: the Americans do not pause. Their trucks are their tanks. For the first time, German command understood that the war was no longer about strategy or bravery, it was about who could keep moving when the fuel ran out. September 15, 1944, the roads of France shook beneath an ocean of engines. From Normandy to Lorraine, convoys thundered eastward, thousands of trucks marked with the red circle of the Red Ball Express. Each one carried life, fuel for Patton, food for soldiers, and ammunition for the guns that never slept. General George S. Patton stood near Verdun, mud splattering his polished boots as endless trucks rumbled past. He watched them for a long moment before saying, "They talk about heroes in tanks, but these boys win wars." Then he raised his hand and saluted a passing driver. Over 6,000 vehicles moved day and night, consuming 100,000 gallons of fuel daily just to feed the war machine ahead. The Red Ball Express was a moving factory, self-repairing, self-feeding, unstoppable. When a truck broke down, another took its place. When bridges collapsed, engineers built new ones overnight. Nothing halted the flow. The system functioned like a living organism. Checkpoints, mechanics, and radio posts dotted the route. Every convoy ran on precision and trust. American organization had turned logistics into an art form. To the Germans, it looked insane. To the Americans, it was efficiency. They had turned chaos into momentum. By mid-September, Patton's Third Army advanced 480 miles in a single month, faster than any force in modern history. Towns cheered as convoys passed. Children waving flags, drivers tossing candy and cigarettes. At night, the red lights of thousands of trucks snaked across the dark hills like veins of fire. And as those engines roared into the distance, one truth echoed through Europe: America's greatest weapon was not its guns, but its ability to move. September 25, 1944, they were called truck drivers, but they were more than that. They were the veins through which victory flowed. Every jerrycan, every bullet, every loaf of bread reached the front because a driver stayed awake another hour, gripping a wheel slick with sweat and rain. Most were young, barely old enough to shave. Some had never driven before the war. Nearly three-quarters were African American soldiers, men who served their country while their country refused to serve them. Equally segregated, underpaid, and overlooked, they still answered the same command: keep 'em rolling. The roads were killers, potholes swallowed tires, bridges collapsed, and snipers hid in trees. Convoys moved without lights through the fog, guided only by the faint red glow of the truck ahead. One driver later said, "We didn't fear the enemy, we feared falling asleep." They worked 20-hour shifts, often living on coffee and canned meat. Sleep came in stolen minutes, heads resting on steering wheels while engines idled. Explosions in the distance reminded them that the war was never far behind. Sometimes they hauled fuel through burning towns, flames reflecting on windshields like molten glass. Each drum of gasoline they carried could destroy them in an instant, but without it, the tanks ahead would die. Few received medals, but everyone knew their worth. Patton himself called them the heroes who never fire a shot. They delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months. At night, when the convoys stopped, the men gathered around small fires. They laughed, sang, and told stories of home. Then the whistles blew, engines roared to life, and the trucks rolled out again, a moving heartbeat in the darkness of war. October 5, 1944, autumn rain turned the French roads into rivers of mud. Engines drowned, axles snapped, and tires tore apart under the strain. But the Red Ball Express did not stop. It adapted. When bridges failed, engineers built new ones from wreckage. When roads collapsed, bulldozers carved fresh paths through the fields. Every broken truck became a donor, its parts scavenged under floodlights by grease-stained mechanics who hadn't slept in days. They worked in the cold, soaked to the bone, hands bleeding from sharp metal and frozen wrenches. The soldiers called it organized chaos. A repair station could fix 24 trucks a day. Fuel drums became makeshift jacks. Ration crates turned into workbenches. Every bolt tightened was another mile Patton could advance. At headquarters, officers studied the fuel reports in disbelief. Despite bombings, weather, and exhaustion, deliveries rarely failed. The system consumed itself to survive, burning fuel to bring fuel, breaking machines to keep others alive. It was brutal, inefficient, and unstoppable. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. Their tanks stood silent, waiting for fuel that never came. Their trains, once the pride of Blitzkrieg, now crawled through bombed rail lines. Meanwhile, the Americans replaced destroyed trucks within days, sometimes hours. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh worked around the clock, flooding Europe with parts, engines, and tires. The Red Ball Express had become more than a convoy, it was a moving factory, a steel bridge between continents. Each driver, mechanic, and engineer was a gear in a machine larger than any general's plan. Patton wrote in his journal, "Wars are fought with weapons, but they are won by men and trucks." And as long as those trucks kept rolling, victory was only a matter of time. October 15, 1944, the Red Ball Express had become a legend, but legends are built on sacrifice. The roads of France, once alive with roaring engines, were now lined with wrecks, trucks burned to their frames, wheels still spinning in the mud. The enemy was no longer just the Germans, it was exhaustion. Drivers pushed themselves beyond human limits, some slept for minutes at a time, hands still gripping the wheel. Others blacked out mid-route, waking only when their trucks were already overturned, brakes failed, tires exploded, and overloaded vehicles plunged into ditches at terrifying speed. The army called them non-combat losses, but the men knew better. Every mile was a battle. One driver wrote in his diary, "We don't dodge bullets, we dodge death itself." Rain fell for days, visibility dropped to nothing, convoys crawled through flooded valleys, engines choking on water, headlights dimmed to protect from Luftwaffe patrols. Some nights, they navigated by the sound of the truck in front of them. If the noise stopped, it meant someone had crashed. Medical tents overflowed with the injured, sprained wrists, broken bones, concussions, signs of a war without gunfire, yet replacements came quickly. There was no time to rest, no room for fear. Orders were simple: keep the fuel moving. In 3 months, over 40,000 drivers had rotated through the Red Ball Express. Each one carried the same burden, knowing that if they slowed down, men at the front would die without fuel. They began to call it the long road home, though few believed they'd ever see home again. But still they rolled on, engines howling through the night, headlights glowing like embers across the ruined countryside, and somewhere ahead, Patton's tanks waited, alive only because those trucks refused to stop. October 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express had reached its breaking point. After 2 months of non-stop motion, the roads that once carried victory were now ground to dust, bridges cracked under endless convoys, engines failed by the hundreds, men who had driven for weeks without rest now looked like ghosts, eyes hollow, hands trembling on the wheel. Patton's armored divisions had reached the German border, but the supply lines behind them stretched nearly 700 miles. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, had to cross half a continent before reaching the front. The Express was winning the war, but bleeding itself dry in the process. Gasoline shortages hit even the trucks that delivered gasoline. Some convoys cannibalized others, draining tanks from broken vehicles to keep the rest moving. Others pushed trucks downhill in neutral, engines dead, saving every drop they could. Still, the motto never changed: keep 'em rolling. In headquarters, officers argued over numbers and tonnage. Could they sustain it? Was it worth the cost? The answer came from the men on the road. They didn't care about reports or statistics, they cared about the tanks waiting for them beyond the horizon. German scouts, watching from the woods, were stunned. Their intelligence reports described it as a living machine that cannot stop. Even in chaos, the Red Ball Express kept moving, its trucks snaking through ruined towns like arteries through a dying body. By late October, the operation had delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies, enough to fuel 3 entire armies. But behind every number lay sweat, exhaustion, and sacrifice. The system that had carried Patton's Blitz across France now faced its own battle, not against the enemy, but against time, fatigue, and gravity itself. The Red Ball Express had become unstoppable, but even machines, no matter how powerful, can only run so long before something breaks. November 10, 1944, winter crept over France like a slow, gray tide. Rain turned to sleet, sleet to snow, and the roads that once thundered with trucks now froze into ribbons of ice. Engines coughed in the cold, metal groaned, and the endless roar of the Red Ball Express began to fade. The drivers bundled in blankets, hands numb on frozen steering wheels. Wind howled through shattered windows, carrying the stench of gasoline and wet canvas. Convoys that once sped through the night now crawled at 10 miles an hour, chains clattering against the ice. Visibility was gone, even the faint red headlights vanished into the blizzard. Still, the motto held: keep 'em rolling. Fuel had to reach the front. Patton's tanks were locked in brutal fighting near Metz, and without supplies, the offensive would stall. The drivers pushed on through the storm, guided only by road markers buried beneath snow. Accidents multiplied, trucks slid into ditches, some vanishing completely under the white drifts. Rescue teams worked with ropes and shovels, dragging men from the wrecks, faces blue from the cold. A single spark from frozen wiring could ignite an inferno in seconds. In supply depots, barrels of fuel froze solid. Engines had to be kept running all night just to survive the temperature. Every drop of gasoline burned was one less for the front, but to stop meant death. German patrols struck from the forests. Taking advantage of the storm, ambushes came and went in seconds, gunfire swallowed by the wind. The drivers didn't fight back, they simply drove through it. The road itself had become the battlefield. By late November, the Red Ball Express was running on fumes, but it refused to die. The convoys moved slower, fewer in number, but still alive, beating like a fading pulse in the frozen veins of Europe. And far ahead, Patton's army still waited, hungry for the fuel that only they could bring. December 20, 1944, winter had swallowed northern France whole. Then, through the blizzard, came thunder, the German counterattack through the Ardennes. It was the last gamble of the Third Reich, and it struck like lightning. Allied lines buckled, fuel depots burned, and chaos ruled the roads. Once again, the fate of an army rested on the Red Ball Express. The convoys faced impossible odds, snow fell in sheets, turning every turn into a trap, engines froze, and drivers could barely see. Beyond their windshields, German tanks prowled the forests, hunting supply lines, while the Luftwaffe strafed from above. Still, the trucks rolled on, because they had to. Fuel had become the true weapon of war. Patton's Third Army, positioned south of the Bulge, needed it to move. Without gasoline, his tanks were steel coffins. Headquarters sent one message across France: move, no matter what. Drivers chained their tires, covered headlights, and pressed forward through black ice and fog. Convoys crawled along mountain passes, engines howling, men praying their trucks wouldn't stall. Some never made it, lost to snowdrifts, mines, or exhaustion, but replacements took their place without hesitation. When Patton ordered his legendary pivot north to rescue Bastogne, the miracle was not his plan, it was logistics. In 48 hours, his army turned and advanced, fueled entirely by the Red Ball Express. Every drop burned in that offensive had been delivered through fire, snow, and sacrifice. German intelligence couldn't believe it. One captured officer said, "We thought they would freeze. Instead, they kept coming." By Christmas, the tide had turned, the Americans pushed back, and Bastogne held. The Red Ball Express had carried not just fuel, but victory, through the dead of winter. January 20, 1945, the new year began not with fireworks, but with engines. Across the frozen plains of France, the Red Ball Express rolled on slower now, battered and weary, but alive. Snow still blanketed the roads, and every mile forward felt like a victory against the cold itself. The Battle of the Bulge had ended, but the scars remained. Trucks still carried the smell of burned rubber and spilled gasoline. Drivers coughed from exhaust and frostbite, their hands cracked and bleeding. Inside frozen gloves, they had survived the winter, but barely. The front kept moving east, across Luxembourg and into Germany. The war was turning, and the express was turning with it. Convoys crossed bridges patched with steel plates and planks. Rumbling toward the Rhine, behind them lay hundreds of wrecked trucks, silent monuments to the road that had won the war. Fuel shortages persisted. The trucks themselves drank thousands of gallons each day just to keep Patton's tanks fed. It was a strange irony, burning fuel to bring fuel, but nobody complained. The rhythm of the road had become their purpose. At night, the sky glowed red with artillery flashes. Sometimes the men stopped to watch, their faces lit by distant fire. One driver whispered, "That's the sound of home getting closer." 4 months, they had lived between the front and the rear, never soldiers, never civilians, but something in between. By now, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 500,000 tons of supplies. No other operation in history had matched its scale or endurance. But even heroes were down. Trucks failed faster than they could be repaired, and replacements grew scarce. Still, they rolled on, engines roaring, headlights glowing through the mist. They were the last link in a chain of victories stretching from the factories of Detroit to the battlefields of Germany. And somewhere ahead, across the Rhine, waited the final road. March 25, 1945, the Rhine River glimmered beneath a pale spring sun, its waters thick with the wreckage of war. On its western bank, the Red Ball Express stood poised for its final journey. The roar of engines, once constant, now sounded different, tired, but proud. Ahead lay Germany itself, and the end of the road. The bridges across the Rhine were miracles of steel and speed. Some were captured intact, others built overnight by U.S. engineers under fire, and across them came the trucks. Thousands of them, hauling the lifeblood of an army that refused to rest, fuel, rations, ammunition, medical supplies, all flowing east like the river below, for the men who had driven since Normandy. This was more than victory, it was closure. They had crossed a continent, from the beaches of France to the heart of the Reich, through rain, mud, and snow. Some didn't make it, their names were written on wooden crosses along the road, but their wheels had never stopped turning. By now, the Red Ball Express had moved over 800,000 tons of supplies. It had kept 3 Allied armies alive, carried tanks across Europe, and shattered the myth of German superiority, even captured officers. Admitted defeat not to guns, but to trucks. When Patton's tanks thundered into Germany, their engines burned the last deliveries from the Express. The war's final miles were written not in blood, but in gasoline and grit. As spring returned to Europe, the convoys finally slowed, engines idled, drivers stepped out, and for the first time in months, silence settled on the roads. They had done the impossible, fed an army across a continent and kept it moving until victory came. The Red Ball Express was never about glory, it was about endurance. Steel, sweat, and willpower rolled into motion. And when the wheels stopped turning, the world they helped save kept moving on. May 1946, Europe was quiet again, the guns had fallen silent, and the convoys that once shook the earth were gone. Only empty roads and rusted signs marked where the Red Ball Express had rolled, but its spirit, the heartbeat of motion, courage, and unity, still echoed across 2 continents. More than 40,000 men had driven for the Express, most returned home to a country still divided by race and memory. For many African American veterans, the war had given them purpose, but not equality. They had kept armies alive, crossed nations under fire, and yet, their names were rarely spoken in parades or history books. Still, their legacy endured. The logistical systems they built in Europe became the blueprint for modern supply chains. Military academies studied the Red Ball Express for decades, calling it a victory of movement. It proved that wars were not only won by courage, but by coordination, determination, and the relentless will to adapt. In 1948, when the Berlin airlift began, many of the same officers who once commanded Red Ball convoys led the effort again, this time in the sky. The lesson remained the same: feed the line, keep it alive, never stop. Across America, quiet reunions were held in garages, bars, and veterans' halls. Men told stories of engines and rain, of coffee gone cold in headlights. Glowing red in the fog, they laughed, sometimes cried, but always remembered the road. Today, monuments stand in Normandy, Chartres, and Mont Saint-Michel, honoring the men of the Red Ball Express, not warriors, but lifelines. Their trucks carried not just fuel, but freedom itself, and though the engines are long silent, some swear that on foggy nights in France, if you listen closely, you can still hear the distant rumble of wheels rolling toward victory. 1952, the war was over, but for thousands of veterans of the Red Ball Express, the silence felt heavier than the roar of engines ever did. They had driven through hell to fuel victory, yet at home, few remembered their names. In history books, their convoys were a footnote, their faces, rarely photographed, faded into the margins of America's triumph. Many returned to segregation, unemployment, and poverty. African American drivers who had kept Patton's army alive were denied basic rights. In the country they helped save, some went back to factories, others drove trucks again, only this time for companies that refused to see them as heroes. Their war had changed the world, but not the world around them. Still, they carried their pride like a medal no one could take away. At reunions in the 1950s, they wore patches with the red circle of the Express, swapping stories over coffee and cigarette smoke. They laughed about near misses and blizzards, but behind their smiles was quiet frustration, a feeling that history had forgotten them long before the world moved on. By the 1960s, America had entered a new era of struggle. Civil rights marches filled the streets, and some of the old drivers joined them. Men who once crossed France under fire now marched for equality at home. They knew something the world was still learning: progress is built on endurance. Just like the road, slowly, recognition began to return. Newspapers printed stories, photographs resurfaced, and the army acknowledged the role of black drivers in the victory of 1944. But for many, it came too late. Their glory had been written in tire tracks, washed away by rain, but never erased. And though the Red Ball Express no longer rolled, its spirit lived on in every man who refused to stop, no matter the road ahead. 1974, 3 decades after the convoys rolled across France, the sound of engines had faded into history, but not from the hearts of those who drove them. The men of the Red Ball Express were older now, their hands slower, their eyes lined with time, but their memories still vivid. They remembered the smell of diesel and fear, the endless road, and the red lights glowing through the fog. For years, they had been forgotten. Then, slowly, America began to remember. Military historians uncovered old supply logs and letters home, piecing together the scale of the impossible: 412,000 tons of supplies, 700 miles of road, 40,000 men. Documentaries were filmed, museums opened exhibits, and the name Red Ball Express returned to the headlines. In 1978, veterans gathered in Washington, D.C., for the first national reunion. Men who hadn't seen each other since the war embraced like brothers. Some wore their old jackets, patched and faded but proud. They spoke not of glory, but of duty, of nights without sleep, of frostbitten hands clutching the wheel, and of the friends who never came home. Hollywood came calling. Movies and television shows dramatized their story, and for the first time, the public saw what had truly powered Patton's advance. The heroes weren't just in tanks, they were behind the wheel. By the 1990s, monuments rose in France and the United States. Tourists walked the same roads once scarred by tire tracks and shell holes. Children listened to veterans telling stories of courage born not in battle, but in persistence. The Red Ball Express had become legend again, this time not for war, but for unity. It was proof that ordinary men could carry extraordinary burdens, and that history always finds its way back to those who earned it. And as the last surviving drivers looked back, they said the same thing: they'd do it all again, if it meant keeping the wheels of freedom turning. 2004, 60 years after the roar of engines faded, the roads of Normandy were quiet again, but if you drive them today, you'll still find traces, faded signposts, rusted fuel drums, and stories whispered by the wind. The Red Ball Express never truly stopped, it simply changed its form, living on in memory, museums, and the endless march of history. In France, small towns still honor the convoys that thundered through their streets in 1944. Old men point to the horizon and say, they came from there. The Americans, the ones who never stopped. In the United States, memorials rise in places like Virginia and Louisiana, carved with the symbol of the red circle and white letters. Visitors leave flowers, dog tags, and photos, thanking men they never met. Historians now call the Red Ball Express one of the greatest logistical achievements in human history. It redefined warfare not through destruction, but through endurance. Every modern supply chain, every convoy, and every war that followed carries its DNA. Documentaries, books, and classrooms tell its story. Young cadets study the lessons it taught. That victory is built not just by those who fight, but by those who move. The men who once drove trucks through hell are gone now, but their legacy rolls on in every soldier who refuses to quit, in every road that leads toward hope, and sometimes, when the fog settles over the fields of northern France. Locals swear they can still hear it, the distant hum of engines, the faint rumble of tires, the echo of courage carried on the wind. For the men of the Red Ball Express, the road never truly ended, it just became part of the world they helped keep moving.